The annual Rose and Dahlia show at St. Mary Mead had begun, as it always did, with a wrangle about tablecloths. Mrs. Price Ridley maintained that white damask showed off the blooms to best advantage, while Mrs. Hartnell, more practical and considerably more red in the face, insisted that anything which did not betray beetroot stains would be a blessing. Miss Marple, in a hat trimmed with a sensible quantity of faded violets, sat quietly in a corner near the jam display and knitted baby booties of pale lemon wool, her blue eyes apparently more interested in a drop stitch than in the contest of wills. It was a fine June afternoon, the sort which made even the most hardened gossip feel benign. The vicar, Reverend Leonard Clement, moved among his parishioners with a slightly distracted smile, as though some private preoccupation tugged at his sleeve. His wife Griselda, bright and careless in a dress a little too sophisticated for the church hall, laughed at him openly. "You look as though you had preached the Sermon on the Mount and discovered no one had listened," she said. "Do stop brooding, Leonard. The roses are doing their best for you, even if the congregation is not." "If only roses were as easy to manage as souls," he murmured, and then coloured faintly, for Miss Marple's needles had paused, quite distinctly. At 3 o'clock precisely, just as the judging of the preserves was to commence, Mr. Arthur Sims, the churchwarden, mounted the little platform and tapped for silence. His bald head gleamed with righteous perspiration. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we proceed to the awards, the vicar has a short announcement of a personal nature." There was at once a rustle through the hall, the soft stir of anticipatory scandal. Miss Hartnell sniffed loudly. Griselda's head turned sharply towards her husband. Only Miss Marple continued to look down, smoothing a length of wool between her fingers. Leonard Clement stepped forward. His usual mildness had deserted him. His face was curiously pale, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. "My friends," he said, and his voice wavered, "you have, many of you, been kind enough to regard me as not only your vicar, but your friend. I wish to say something which I fear may alter your opinion of me. It concerns an event long past, but one which has consequences in the present." "That'll be a woman," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley to her neighbour with grim certainty. "Mark my words." Before he could continue, the door at the far end of the hall banged open with startling violence. A young woman stood on the threshold, breathless, her fair hair dishevelled, a cheap little hat askew on her head. Her dress, of bright blue artificial silk, was travel-creased and wholly unsuitable for the decorous gloom of the church hall. "Reverend Clement," she cried, her voice carrying clearly above the murmur that rose, "you must stop this at once. He has been murdered." The words seemed to fall like a stone into a still pond. Ripples of horror and incredulity spread outward. Someone dropped a plate. Somewhere else a child began to cry. Griselda caught at her husband's arm. Who has been murdered?" she demanded. The girl's eyes, very blue and very desperate, swept the room and came to rest with a strange intensity on the vicar's stricken face. "Your son," she said. "Your son, Mr. Clement. They've killed him on the common." The silence which followed was total. Only Miss Marple, whose knitting had slipped unheeded into her lap, looked not startled, but very, very attentive. For a moment no one moved. It was as though the entire assembly of St. Mary Mead had been transformed into wax figures, posed around teacups and plum cakes, eyes fixed upon the stranger and the vicar. Reverend Ashford recovered first, though his voice trembled. "Lydia," he said quietly, "this is neither the time nor the place." "On the contrary," the woman replied, her tone controlled but vibrating with emotion, "it is precisely the time. You've hidden long enough." A rustle of shocked whispers stirred the crowd like a breeze through corn. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, eyes shining with avid curiosity. "Lydia," she repeated under her breath. "I don't recall any Lydia. Do you, Jane?" Miss Marple's fingers returned calmly to their knitting. "Names come and go, Dolly," she said mildly, "although some have a habit of returning when least convenient." Constance suddenly found her voice. "Father," she cried, half-choked. "What is she talking about? That! What son?" Reverend Ashford winced as though struck. He looked around, his gaze passing over the parishioners, over Mrs. Fletcher, rigid and staring, and finally alighting on Miss Marple under the oak. Something like resignation settled over his features. "Everyone," he said, clearing his throat, "I must ask you to excuse us. This is a private matter." It was, of course, the last thing anyone in St. Mary Mead intended to do, excuse themselves from a scene promising so much. But there was something in the vicar's voice and authority, unused but still present, that compelled a degree of obedience. People drifted back toward their seats and tables, though not so far that they could not hear should any raised voices emerge from the vicarage. Lydia's eyes flashed. "Private, you made it very public when you abandoned me to raise your child alone." A collective gasp went up, quickly smothered but no less heartfelt. Miss Hartnell actually clutched at her pearls in a gesture so theatrical it might have seemed comic under other circumstances. "Please," the vicar said hoarsely, "come inside. We will talk there." He did not touch Lydia, but he gestured toward the French doors opening onto the lawn. For a moment it seemed she might defy him. Then, with a tight, proud lift of her chin, she turned and walked toward the house. Reverend Ashford followed, shoulders bowed. As the doors closed behind them, the garden erupted into low-pitched, buzzing conversation. "Well," Mrs. Bantry breathed, thoroughly energized. "A secret love child. In Saint. Mary Mead! Jane, did you ever—" Miss Marple's needles clicked placidly. "People are very much the same everywhere, Dolly," she said. "Even in St. Mary Mead, particularly in Sainthood. Mary Mead!" "But the vicar," Mrs. Bantry protested. "Our vicar." "Vicars," observed Miss Marple, "are first and foremost men. One must never forget that. It saves a deal of disappointment." Near the tea table, Colonel Melchett, who had arrived in his capacity as patron of the fete, and not, he would have said, as chief constable, was frowning with professionals concern. "Dash it all," he muttered to Inspector Slack, who had been conscripted to help judge the jam competition and now looked as though he would rather be facing an armed burglar. "This will be all over the county by tomorrow." "It'll be all over the village by this evening, sir," Slack returned grimly, eyeing the chattering guests. "And that lady, Lydia, was it? Didn't look the type to go quietly." Under the oak, Miss Marple watched Constance. The girl stood utterly still, face white, hands clenched in the folds of her black dress. Mrs. Fletcher had moved to her side, one work-worn hand resting awkwardly on the girl's arm. Yet it was not maternal comfort Miss Marple saw there, but something tighter, warier, almost proprietorial. "Poor child," Miss Marple murmured. "Which one, Mrs.?" Bantry asked, distracted. "Oh," said Miss Marple, her needles gleaming in the dappled light. "I rather think several." Inside the vicarage, a door slammed. By 6 o'clock that evening, the vicarage garden bore no trace of bunting or trestle tables. Only flattened grass and a few stray paper napkins caught in the rose bushes testified to the earlier festivity. Yet in the cottages and parlours of St. Mary Mead, the echoes of the afternoon's drama had only just begun to swell. At the Blue Boar, where a few of the more adventurous villagers had gone for an early supper, the landlord found himself pouring far more pints than usual. "I always said," declared Mr. Toms, the butcher, thumping his glass down with unnecessary force, "there was something a bit too saintly about our Reverend Ashford. Never trust a man who smiles that much. Hides things, that sort does." "Rubbish," Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed from her corner table, though her eyes shone with avid curiosity. "All this modern talk about past mistakes being dragged into the open, perfectly deplorable. If the poor man had a lapse of judgment in his youth, that's no business of ours." "Lapse of judgment," Mr. Tom snorted. "Secret love child, more like. And that London woman, Miss Hartley, did she say? Marching in like a queen with a grievance. Mark my words, she's after money." Major Weatherby, who prided himself on military logic, cleared his throat. If the boy's 18, as she claimed, then all this happened before Ashford came to St. Mary Mead. Pre-village history. Can't hold that against him, eh? Damned awkward, of course, but not criminal. People do not travel all the way from London, Mrs. Price Ridley observed, to make scenes at garden parties unless they have a very particular reason. In her cosy sitting room on the high street, Miss Marple sat with a tray table laid with a carefully prepared supper, a slice of cold ham, some pickled beetroot, a wedge of cheese, and a small brown teapot. The baby booties lay completed beside her chair, absurdly innocent in their pale yellow softness. "Well, Raymond," she said aloud, addressing the framed photograph of her nephew, "it appears our peaceful village has acquired a complication. A secret son, an anxious housekeeper, an oddly composed vicar, and a stranger who has practised her speech in front of a mirror. Such a lot of human nature in one small garden." She poured herself another cup of tea and considered the matter dispassionately. It was not the existence of a love child that interested her. She had lived too long and seen too much to be shocked by lapses in clerical morality. It was rather the different flavours of reaction. Constance's bewildered anger, Mrs. Fletcher's near panic, the vicar's strange air of weary relief, and old Badgers the gardener, whose retreating back had spoken of something more than distaste. "Resentment," Mr. Marple murmured, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Long-standing resentment and sudden revelation. That combination, in my experience, is rarely without consequences. Outside, the church clock struck the half-hour. At the vicarage, a light shone in the study window, a small square of yellow in the deepening blue of evening. Somewhere within that room, Miss Hartley, the vicar, and perhaps Mrs. Fletcher were talking, arguing, remembering. Truths were being dragged from their hiding places. And in St. Mary Mead, truth had a way of upsetting far more than reputations. Mrs. Fletcher clutched the doorframe as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. For a brief, disconcerting moment she stared straight ahead, her eyes unfocused, before they fixed on Constance and Miss Marple making their way across the lawn. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice cracking oddly on the name. "Miss Marple, if you please." Constance reached her first. "What is it? Where's father? Where is that woman?" Mrs. Fletcher's mouth worked soundlessly before any words emerged. "Your father? He's taken ill. It's the shock, I suppose. Miss Hartley is with him. I must fetch Dr. Haydock at once." Miss Marple laid a light, steadying hand on the housekeeper's arm. "Of course, Mrs. Fletcher. But perhaps, before you go, we might see for ourselves that the vicar is as comfortable as circumstances permit." For an instant, something very like panic flickered in Mrs. Fletcher's eyes. Then she stepped aside with mechanical politeness. Yes, of course. Only don't excite him. He's had a trying afternoon." The sitting room beyond the French doors bore all the marks of hasty, heated confrontation. A chair lay overturned, its cushion askew. The small occasional table by the fireplace had been knocked sideways, scattering papers and spilling ink onto the carpet. A coffee-ice cup lay shattered near the hearth, its dark contents seeping slowly into the rug like congealing blood. On the sofa, Reverend Ashford sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. His complexion had the greyish tinge of a man who has received a mortal blow of the emotional kind. Beside him stood the auburn-haired woman, Miss Hartley, her gloved hands clenched around a folded handkerchief. Her face, though pale, burned with an anger that seemed to war with something softer. "Father!" Constance hurried to his side, dropping to her knees before him. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Fletcher said. "I am quite all right, my dear," the vicar said, though his voice emerged thin and strained. "Merely tired. Events have accumulated rather suddenly." Miss Marple stepped just inside the doorway, careful to disturb nothing. Her eyes flicked briefly over the room. The scattered papers, the overturned chair, the ink, the broken cup. Quarrels, she reflected, rarely kept within the boundaries of coasters and conversational distance. "You mustn't distress yourself, Reverend Ashford," she said mildly. "Shock is a most exhausting thing, particularly for one of sensitive conscience." Miss Hartley gave a short, bitter laugh. Sensitive conscience. That's one way of putting it. She looked down at the vicar. "Tell them, Timothy. Tell them about Daniel." "Daniel?" Constance's voice sounded very small. "His name is Daniel?" "Yes," Miss Hartley replied, her tone softening. "Daniel Hartley. He's 18, clever, stubborn, proud, very much his father's son." The vicar winced. Whether at the description or the ownership it implied, Miss Marple could not be entirely certain. He should have been here," he murmured. "I asked him to come, but he refused. Said if I wanted to claim him, I could do so alone." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose ever so slightly. "You invited him, then, to the garden party?" A faint nod. "I wrote to him last month. Told him I intended to acknowledge him publicly. He said I was a coward and a hypocrite. That if I had wanted to be a father, I should have begun 18 years ago." Miss Hartley's fingers tightened on the handkerchief. "So I came in his place, to see if you meant it. To see what kind of man my son's father had become." Constance rose slowly, looking from her father to Miss Hartley with wide, wounded eyes. "You were going to tell everyone today during the party, and you said nothing to me." "I meant to," the vicar whispered. "Afterward, when I had found the words." From the doorway came a small, decisive cough. Mrs. Fletcher, who had not yet departed for Dr. Haydock despite her declaration, hovered there with an air of uneasy impatience. "If I'm to fetch the doctor, I had best go now," she said. "You'll all be wanting your tea later." Miss Marple regarded her with mild curiosity. "You knew of Daniel, of course, Mrs. Fletcher?" The housekeeper's hands twisted in her apron. "I've kept this house 18 years, Miss Marple. I know what comes in and what goes out, that's all." "But not," Miss Marple said gently, "what is kept hidden in between." Fletcher's gaze flickered nervously toward the vicar, then away. "I'll fetch the doctor," she repeated, and slipped out with a swiftness that belied her years. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind arranging the fragments of the afternoon like the pieces of a very delicate pattern. There was fear in this house, she decided. Fear, resentment, and a secret grown too large to contain, and such things in her experience were fertile soil for tragedy. She swayed in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame as though it were the only thing preventing her collapse. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice oddly thin. Would someone fetch Dr. Haydock? And perhaps Colonel Melchett? There's been an accident." Constance darted forward. "Is it Father? What's happened to Father?" Mrs. Fletcher's lips moved soundlessly for a moment before she answered. "It's Miss Hartley, miss. In the study. She just fell, the Reverend thought perhaps a faint, but I think..." Miss Marple was already moving toward the house, her light step belying her age. "Accidents don't usually require the presence of the Chief Constable," she remarked in a mild tone. "Constance, ring the doctor at once. Mrs. Fletcher, show me, if you please." The air inside the vicarage felt cooler, almost chill after the scented heat of the garden. Miss Fletcher led the way down the narrow corridor, her keys jangling faintly at her waist. At the study door she hesitated, crossing herself in a gesture oddly out of place in an Anglican household, then pushed it open. Veronica Hartley lay sprawled beside the vicar's desk, one arm flung at an awkward angle, auburn hair loosened from its pins. Her hat lay crushed nearby. A crystal decanter and 2 sherry glasses stood on a tray at the edge of the desk. One glass had toppled, its dark contents staining the turkey carpet like an ugly bloom. Miss Marple went first to the fallen woman, kneeling with surprising ease. Her fingers, cool and competent, touched the inside of Veronica's wrist, then the soft skin of her throat. She noted the slight bluish tinge at the lips, the half-open eyes with their oddly fixed expression. "She is quite dead," Miss Marple said gently. "No use sending for Dr. Haydock in haste, though he must come of course. When did she fall, Mrs. Fletcher?" "I don't rightly know, ma'am. They were talking, arguing, I should say. Then the Reverend sent me to see the last of the guests off from the front. When I came back he was kneeling beside her, calling her name. He said she had staggered and dropped before he could reach her." "And where is the Reverend now, Mrs.?" Fletcher swallowed. "In his room, praying," he said. "He looked broken, ma'am." Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment on the decanter. "You did not, I collect, see Miss Hartley take that glass?" "No, ma'am. The sherry was already poured when I brought the tray." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "I think, Mrs. Fletcher, that the sooner Colonel Melchett is informed the better. In matters of sudden death it is always wise to assume less and observe more." She turned back to the still figure on the floor, her expression mild, almost vague, yet her mind, sharp as a needle, was already sorting small discrepancies, tucking them away, as another village pattern she had seen too often before. Nothing, she felt, was accidental here, Dr. Oz. Haydock arrived with his usual brisk efficiency, his black bag swinging at his side, Inspector Slack close on his heels with an expression of grim anticipation. Constance followed behind them, pale and wide-eyed, clinging to the doorframe as though it might steady her spinning world. "Where is she?" Dr. Haydock demanded. "In here, Doctor," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to allow him access to the study. She watched intently as he knelt beside Miss Hartley, his practised fingers checking for a pulse, then gently lifting one of the woman's eyelids. Slack hovered nearby, his sharp eyes darting between the body, the vicar, and Miss Marple. "No one touches anything," he barked, more from habit than necessity. His gaze narrowed on Reverend Ashford. "You've not moved her, sir?" The vicar shook his head slowly. "She collapsed while we were talking. I called for Mrs. Fletcher, but..." His voice faltered. "But you didn't think to send for the doctor at once?" Slack's tone was coolly accusatory. "There was so much being said," the vicar replied, sounding dazed rather than defensive. "I thought she had fainted." De Haydock rose to his feet, his face grave. "She's dead," he said simply. "Has been for some minutes at least. Rigour hasn't set in yet, but the lividity is beginning. And look at the lips, Slack. That bluish tinge, and the pupils. I don't care for it." "Meaning what exactly, Doctor?" Slack asked, though his voice had taken on a certain alert sharpness. "I mean, it doesn't look like heart failure or a simple faint. I'd say poison, tentatively. But you'll get your proper answer from the post-mortem." His eyes strayed to the tea tray. "She drank anything just before she went down." "Tea?" Miss Marple said quietly. "There are 3 cups. One broken on the floor, presumably Miss Hartley's, and you see, Inspector, how the other 2 are full and quite cool. That suggests she alone drank, and the gentleman did not." Slack shot her a wary look. He was used to Miss Marple's deceptively mild comments leading somewhere inconvenient. And why didn't they drink, then? Reverend Ashford seemed to rouse himself. Our argument, became quite heated. I hardly remember the tea at all. Miss Hartley poured herself a cup while telling me what she intended to do. She said she would introduce my son to the village, expose me from the pulpit itself if needed. "And where is this son?" Slack demanded sharply. "In London," the vicar answered slowly. "Or he was, until last week. She said she had brought him down near here, that he would arrive soon." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "You'll want the scene left as is, Slack. I'll ring the coroner. In the meantime, you might ask who prepared this tea." All eyes turned, almost as one, toward Mrs. Fletcher, who had lingered in the doorway as though hoping to remain unnoticed. Her hands twisted in her apron, and her voice, when it came, was thin and shaking. "I did, Inspector," she whispered. "But I swear on my soul there was nothing wrong with it when I carried it in." Miss Marple watched the woman's trembling hands and lowered eyes, her own expression politely blank. She had seen such hands before in another village many years ago, belonging to a woman who had not poisoned anyone herself, but who knew very well who had. Miss Marple walked back toward the house with the unhurried step of an elderly lady with nothing in particular to do, though her mind moved with far greater speed. At the French doors she paused. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see Inspector Slack taking down notes while Dr. Haydock spoke in low tones. Constance stood just outside the study, clinging to the doorframe. Her face was still pale, but her eyes burned with a fierce, bewildered anger. "Is it true?" she demanded as Miss Marple approached. "They're saying Miss Hartley was poisoned at our vicarage during our garden party. It sounds like something out of a dreadful crime novel." "Fiction often borrows from life, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "and life is unfortunately not obliged to be reasonable." Constance swallowed hard. "They think father did it, don't they, because of what she said about the son? The police are obliged to consider the most obvious explanation first," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "It is not always the correct one." "Father wouldn't hurt anyone," Constance insisted. He's weak sometimes, yes. He avoids unpleasantness until it becomes worse. But murder? No, I don't believe it." Miss Marple merely patted her arm and turned as Inspector Slack emerged from the study, shutting the door firmly behind him. "Body'll stay where it is until the coroner's seen it," he announced briskly. "No one is to enter that room. Reverend Ashford, I'm afraid I must ask you not to leave the vicarage for the time being. Routine procedure." "Am I under arrest?" the vicar asked quietly. "Not yet, sir. But you've got more motive than most." Slack turned to Mrs. Fletcher. "You too, Mrs. Fletcher. I'll need a full statement in the morning. For tonight, keep to your room after supper. And no more tea being poured in this house, if you don't mind." Fletcher nodded, looking as if the instruction about tea were the final straw in an already impossible day. "I shall walk home now, Inspector," Miss Marple said serenely. "I imagine there will be little more to see tonight." He eyed her with suspicion. "You'll be seeing plenty, I've no doubt, Miss Marple. Just don't go filling people's heads with your notions before I've had a chance to interview them." "One wouldn't dream of interfering," Miss Marple replied. And if Slack had known her better, he might have found that reassurance rather less comforting. On the lane outside the vicarage, she encountered Mrs. Bantry's motor car drawing up with a squeal of brakes. Mrs. Bantry herself leaned out, eyes alight. "Jane, is it true? Murder at the vicarage? Get in at once. You're coming back to Gossington and telling me everything." Miss Marple allowed herself to be shepherded into the passenger seat. As they rattled down the lane, Mrs. Bantry bombarded her with questions, but Miss Marple answered only the most basic, her mind fitting together details like pieces of patchwork. "A love child," Mrs. Bantry said, almost with relish. "And the mother turning up after all these years. It's like that case of yours, the one with the colonel and the barmaid." "There are certain similarities," Miss Marple admitted, "though here I think the pattern may be more tangled. Did you notice Mrs. Fletcher's behaviour, Dolly? She was not merely shocked. She was frightened. And our Mr. Badger's too. He knew more than he wished to." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Do you think they're hiding the boy? The vicar's son?" "I rather think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that the boy may not be nearly so hidden as all that." Mrs. Bantry stared at her. "Jane, what on earth do you mean?" But Miss Marple merely folded her hands over her knitting bag and looked out at the darkening hedgerows, her expression as mild and unreadable as ever, while in her mind a quiet, little village map of relationships, scandals and opportunities for murder continued to grow more detailed by the minute. Miss Marple left Abbott's shop with her basket on her arm and a faint crease between her brows. The bells of St. Mary Mead chimed the half-hour. their familiar notes at odds with the quietly sinister pattern forming in her mind. Lemons purchased twice, a poisoned cup of tea prepared for a woman who always took lemon, and a household where secrets had been carefully curated for 18 years. Her next call, made under the perfectly reasonable pretext of inquiring after an elderly neighbour's chest complaint, was at the small cottage lent by the county council to the new district nurse. Miss Pollitt opened the door at once, tall, brisk, efficient, with a pleasant, rather square face and steady grey eyes that missed little. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Do come in. You've been meaning to let me see your blood pressure, I'm sure," she said with good-humoured firmness. Miss Marple allowed herself to be settled into a chair, submitted to the cuff and stethoscope with meek patience, and only when Nurse Pollitt pronounced herself satisfied did she, "See, these small ailments are troublesome at my age, nurse. One must take what comfort one can, hot water with lemon for the throat, for instance. I believe you favour it yourself?" Nurse Pollitt looked faintly surprised. "Lemon, yes. I bought some yesterday from Abbott's. I seem to be making endless pots of hot drinks for half the village." "For Miss Hartley, perhaps?" Miss Marple ventured mildly. "I never met her," the nurse replied. "I was called to the vicarage twice this month, but only for Mrs. Fletcher's rheumatism and the vicar's insomnia. Yesterday I was at the surgery until late afternoon, then home." She hesitated. "Though now you mention it, I did see a woman in a burgundy suit on the London bus last week. She got off at Much Benham. Attractive, well-dressed. Could have been your Miss Hartley." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully in her lap. "Last week, you say? How very interesting. We had all understood that Mrs. Hartley's arrival was quite sudden." "I have good eyes," Nurse Pollitt remarked, "and a better memory for faces than for names." She argued with the conductor about a change of route. "Very determined lady." She glanced at Miss Marple. "Do you suppose her death was really an accident? They say heart failure in the village." "In my experience," Miss Marple said gently, rising with the aid of her stick, "people rarely die of heart failure immediately after announcing long-buried scandals. Thank you, nurse, you have been most helpful, though perhaps not in the way you imagine." When she reached the lane again, she almost collided with Inspector Slack, striding towards the vicarage with bullish determination. His expression told its own story. "They've just finished the post-mortem," he informed her, barely pausing. "Doctor confirms cyanide. We've enough to charge the vicar, means, motive, and a jolly convenient tea tray. I'm going to place him under arrest." Miss Marple regarded him with a mildness that concealed keen anxiety. "You're quite certain no one else had opportunity, Inspector?" "Plenty had opportunity," he snapped. "But only one had his livelihood and reputation at stake. I'm not blind to gossip, Miss Marple. Secret love child is motive enough for any man." She watched him march away, her lips pursed. Somewhere between Abbott's and Lemons, Nurse Pollitt's observant memory, and those missing letters lay the true connection. And if Inspector Slack arrested the wrong person now, the real murderer, who had planned so carefully, would feel entirely secure. Miss Marple turned not towards home, but towards the vicarage garden, where she spied Constance sitting rigidly on the same stone bench as the day before, a folded letter in her hands and a look of stunned disbelief on her face. Miss Marple regarded the weeping nurse with a gentleness that did not in the least blunt the sharpness of her thoughts. Emotion in her long experience could be sincere, and yet sit quite comfortably beside cold deliberation. "You wish to protect him," she said softly. "That is very natural. But poison, Miss Pollitt, is a most considered thing. It requires preparation, opportunity, and a certain knowledge." Miss Pollitt stared at her, horrified. "You think cyanide? I may be a nurse, Miss Marple, but I'm not a monster. Yes, I bought lemons. Yes, I warned Margaret not to come, but I did not put anything in her tea. You knew she liked lemon, however." "I knew everything about her once," the nurse replied bitterly. "I saw her at her worst and at her bravest. But murder," she shook her head violently. "When I heard she was dead, I thought perhaps it was Providence. Then I thought it was Timothy. God forgive me. It seemed exactly like him, to panic and do the worst possible thing for the best possible reason." Miss Marple rose, gathering her bag. "Providence, in my experience, is often given credit for the tidy work of human hands. Tell me, did you see Miss Hartley yesterday before the garden party? The hesitation was only a fraction of a second, but it was there." "She came to me first," Miss Pollitt admitted. "Midday, she wanted to know everything about Timothy, about his parish, his daughter. She was excited, almost triumphant. Said she meant to confront him in public so he could not wriggle out of his duty." "And you?" "I begged her not to make a scene. I even offered her money, my savings. She laughed at me, said she wasn't interested in my paltry scraps. She wanted acknowledgement for her son. And if I can't have that, she said, I'll see him ruined. Miss Marple's eyes grew very thoughtful. So she came determined to break his world apart. That would give several people reason to wish her silenced. When Miss Marple stepped back into the lane, the quiet respectability of St. Mary Mead seemed almost indecent. Behind its lace curtains and tidy hedges, she knew, lay any number of small desperations. She walked slowly toward the vicarage, her mind sorting motives with the neatness of a housewife arranging jars on a pantry shelf. There was Reverend Ashford, whose entire vocation stood to be shattered. Mrs. Fletcher, clinging fiercely to her idea of the household she had built. Miss Pollitt, whose unspoken love had lasted 18 years. Constance, whose very identity had been threatened in a single sentence. At the vicarage gate she paused. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, sharp, acrid, recent. Her eyes narrowed. Smoke at a vicarage was not in itself remarkable, yet Dr. Stairs. Haydock's parting words that morning returned to her. Keep them out of the study, Jane, until the coroner's done. No fires, no dusting, nothing moved. Inside, the hall was in confusion. Constance stood white-faced beside Mrs. Fletcher, who clutched a singed duster. A thin trail of soot marked the skirting board near the study door. It were only a bit of smouldering, Miss Marple, Mrs. Fletcher insisted shakily. In the waste paper basket. I was just going in to straighten the room when I smelled it. Must have been a cigarette end from one of those policemen. Constable Barnes does not smoke, Miss Marple said mildly, nor does Inspector Slack, since though his wife made him give it up after that unfortunate incident with the curtains. What, may I ask, was burning? Constance answered in a strained voice. Old letters, Miss Marple. A whole bundle of them, half charred. Some were addressed to father, some to the chaplain St. Bartholomew's Hospital, all in the same hand. Miss Hartley's, no doubt, Miss Marple murmured. So someone has attempted rather belatedly to tidy up the past. She looked from the frightened girl to the agitated housekeeper and thought of the nurse weeping in her neat cottage. Yes, the time had come. Constance, my dear, she said gently, I think it would be best if you, your father, Mrs. Fletcher and Miss Pollitt all came to tea at my cottage this evening. There are one or two little matters I should like to clear up. As she left them, Miss Marple permitted herself the smallest of smiles. Tea, she had always found, was an excellent medium for observing human nature, especially when there was no lemon on the tray, and everyone present knew exactly why. Mr. Badger stared at the paring knife as though seeing it for the first time. His jaw worked soundlessly before he managed, with effort, to meet Miss Marple's gaze. Nothing wrong with keeping the tools clean, he muttered. Lemons clean the rust. Old gardener's trick, that. Quite, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, though I rather think you used these particular lemons for something else yesterday. You see, Mr. Abbott remembers you buying none at all. Yet there is lemon on your knife, a lemon seed on your bench, and no crop on the vicarage tree. One does begin to wonder. He sank slowly onto an upturned crate, shoulders sagging. I never meant for it to turn out like this, he said dully. Not with the police and all. Miss Marple's tone remained mild and dominant. Then perhaps you will tell me exactly what you did mean. Badgers took off his cap, twisting it between his rough hands. Mrs. Fletcher came to me in the morning, said there'd be a visitor as afternoon, a lady as had done the vicar a sight of harm long ago. Said she liked lemon in her tea and that there'd be trouble enough if she wasn't checked. Checked, repeated Miss Marple, softly. She brought that little bottle from the shed, the cyanide I keep for wasps' nests. Said we could make it look like an accident after. Say she'd confused it with something else. Only just enough to make the woman ill, she said. Scare her off. I wouldn't agree at first, but she talked about the vicar, about his service to the village. Said this woman would ruin him, ruin Constance, ruin us all. And so you agreed, he nodded miserably. She gave me one of the lemons the nurse had brought, told me to be quick. I sliced it thin, rubbed a drop of the stuff into 2 or 3 slices, just on one side. Mrs. Fletcher said she'd make sure the woman took those for her tea. I swear, Miss Marple, I never meant to kill her, just frighten her, send her back to London. Miss Marple's eyes were very clear now. Yet only Miss Hartley drank lemon. Mrs. Fletcher took her tea plain. A curious arrangement, if she truly meant to share the risk. Badgers looked up sharply, alarm dawning. She said she'd drink lemon too, so it would look fair. Said she'd swap cups at the last minute if anything seemed amiss. I never saw the serving myself. I was out by the shed when it all happened. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. You have been very foolish, Mr. Badgers, but also very honest. I think for the moment you should say nothing more to anyone until Inspector Slack arrives. I will, as far as possible, ensure he understands precisely the how you were used." As she walked back toward the vicarage, her mind arranged the new information with practiced neatness. Mrs. Fletcher, willing to poison another while keeping herself conveniently safe. Miss Pollitt, whose love had curdled into something dangerously close to obsession. And behind them, both, the vicar himself, whose genuine shock suggested ignorance, yet whose past choices had drawn all these tangled loyalties into being. It was time, she decided, to bring them all together, vicar, housekeeper, nurse, and Constance, and to introduce one final, carefully chosen test. Human nature, in Miss Marple's long experience, was never more revealing than when placed under gentle, unexpected pressure. Miss Marple left Mr. Sir Badgers sitting amid his pots and tools, his confession hanging in the air like the scent of crushed lemon. She knew better than to press further. A man who had carried guilt for years would tell the rest soon enough to the authorities. Her task now was to ensure that the authorities listened in the correct spirit. Inspector Slack unfortunately rarely listened in any spirit but his own. When she returned to the vicarage, she found him in the drawing room with Reverend Ashford and Constance, his notebook open and his patience thin. Mrs. Fletcher sat stiffly on the edge of a chair, hands clenched in her lap, a picture of wounded respectability. "I've told you everything," she was saying, as Miss Marple entered quietly. Timothy knew nothing of that woman's letters, and he most certainly did not poison her tea. Miss Marple settled herself near the window, apparently absorbed in straightening a dropped stitch. "Inspector," she remarked mildly, "I wonder if you have considered the matter of the lemons." Slack sighed. "I've had quite enough lemons for one investigation, Miss Marple. Yet they remain rather awkward," she continued placidly. "Mr. Badgers tells me the vicarage tree has borne no fruit this year, and that no lemons were purchased for household use by Mrs. Fletcher. Yet 3 perfect slices appeared yesterday on the tea tray, prepared, as we know, in advance of Miss Hartley's arrival. Someone anticipated that she would ask for lemon." Constance looked between the adults, comprehension dawning. "I bought lemons," she said slowly, "for a cake I never had time to bake. I left 3 in the kitchen bowl." All eyes turned to Mrs. Fletcher, whose face had taken on a greyish hue. "You were always so careless, my girl," the housekeeper said hoarsely, "leaving things about, trusting that the world is kind." Her composure cracked. She pressed a shaking handkerchief to her mouth. "You moved the slices," Miss Marple said gently, "from the innocent plate Constance left to the special dish Mr. Badgers had prepared for Miss Hartley." Inspector Slack straightened, startled. "Badgers? Oh yes," Miss Marple continued with a touch of sadness. "He has been dreadfully foolish, poor man, allowing his skill with poisons from wartime to be used in your service. He believed you wished only to frighten the woman away. You knew better." Mrs. Fletcher gave a low, broken laugh. "You speak of knowing human nature, Miss Marple. What do you think would have happened if that creature had lived? She would have taken everything. Timothy's position, Constance's future, the very respect this village holds for its church. You chose murder rather than allow the truth its own working out," Miss Marple replied, "and in doing so you have achieved precisely what you feared. Scandal, sorrow, and the ruin of innocent lives." Then Reverend Ashford rose, his voice very quiet. His eyes held unspeakable pain. "Inspector, the gardener will tell you how he was drawn into this, and who gave the order." In the vicarage study that evening, Miss Marple sat in her accustomed low chair, knitting lying idle in her lap. Around her the little room was crowded. Reverend Ashford, white-faced. Constance, tense beside him. Mrs. Fletcher, rigid near the tea tray. Mr. Hull, Badgers, turning his cap in his hands. Miss Pollitt, Inspector Slack, and Colonel Melchett. The air seemed thick with unsaid things. "Inspector," Miss Marple began mildly, "you are prepared, I think, to arrest our poor vicar." Slack cleared his throat. He had the strongest motive, and he was alone with the deceased when she died. "And yet," Miss Marple went on, "the facts are stubborn. The poison was almost certainly in the lemon. Miss Hartley always took lemon in her tea. Someone knew that and prepared accordingly. Our vicarage tree bore no fruit, so lemons had to be specially obtained." Her eyes rested a moment on Miss Pollitt. "You bought 6, nurse, but kept them here, still uncut." The nurse nodded, flushing. "I never went near the vicarage kitchen. Whereas," Miss Marple continued, "Mr. Abbott remembers a second purchase, 3 lemons by Miss Constance, for a cake that was never baked." Constance stared. I left them on the pantry table. I never touched them again." Precisely, Sir Marple, said Mr. Armable. After that, any person in the house might handle them, and some person did. Old Mr. Badgers has already told me how he was persuaded to cut those lemons and rub them with cyanide, only enough to make a body sick. All eyes turned to the gardener. He bowed his head. Mrs. Fletcher was beside herself, he muttered. Said the lady would ruin the vicar, ruin Miss Constance. I thought just to scare her away. It was not you who decided on death, Miss Marple said gently. You tampered with a few slices, but it was Mrs. Fletcher who placed every one of them on the tray, ensuring that the largest dose went into Miss Hartley's cup. She alone knew that the victim must certainly take lemon, Mrs. Cecil. Fletcher's hand seized the back of a chair. I did what had to be done, she burst out. For 20 years I kept this house respectable. Those letters came and I burned them, every one. I would not see him drag through the mud for a girl who trapped him before he had a chance in life. The vicar gave a low cry. You had no right, he whispered. If I sinned, it was mine to answer, not yours to conceal with murder. Inspector Slack stepped forward, brusque to hide his discomfort. You understand, Mrs. Fletcher, I must take you into custody. She straightened, a strange pride in her lined face. I knew it would come to this, she said. I don't repent protecting him, only that I trusted Tom to leave it at a scare. When they had gone, the room seemed suddenly bare. Constance leaned against the mantel, eyes overbright. Is it all over, Miss Marple?